What happened next changed everything, and I mean absolutely everything. When 73-year-old Margaret Chen opened that lawyer's office door on a cold Tuesday morning in November 2023, she had no idea she was about to witness the most brutal financial reckoning in Seattle family court history. The woman who had spent 2 years tormenting her, manipulating her son, and plotting to steal her life's work was about to discover that every cruel word, every calculated insult, every attempt at intimidation had been recorded. But the real shock? Margaret had already given away every single penny of her $47 million fortune to charity, leaving her entitled daughter-in-law with absolutely nothing except a collection of audio recordings that would destroy her reputation forever. Meet Margaret Chen, a woman whose story will make you believe in justice again. At 73, Margaret stood barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and hands that showed decades of hard work building her tech consulting empire from nothing. She lived in a modest craftsman-style home in Seattle's Wallingford neighborhood, the same house she'd bought in 1982 when it was all she could afford. Despite her wealth, Margaret drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, shopped at Costco with coupons, and still darned her own socks. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet widow who brought homemade soup when they were sick and never missed a community meeting. What they didn't know was that Margaret had spent the last 45 years building Chen Tech Solutions from a one-woman operation in her garage to a company that consulted for Fortune 500 giants. She'd never remarried after her husband David died in 2019, pouring all her love into her work and her only child, 38-year-old Michael. The stakes couldn't have been higher because Margaret's fortune represented not just money, but 5 decades of 18-hour days, missed vacations, and sacrifices that would make most people weep. Every dollar carried the weight of her immigrant parents' dreams, her late husband's support, and her determination to leave something meaningful behind. But here's what made Margaret's situation so heartbreaking. She genuinely wanted to love her daughter-in-law. When Michael married 29-year-old Jessica Hamilton in 2021, Margaret opened her heart completely, hoping to finally have the daughter she'd always dreamed of. She had no idea she was welcoming a predator into her family. If you're dealing with toxic family dynamics or wondering how to protect yourself from manipulation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share real stories of people who found their strength and fought back. And please, hit the like button if this story resonates with you, because it helps us reach others who need to hear these messages of hope and justice. Margaret's life before the storm was beautifully ordinary in the way that comes from decades of routine built on love and purpose. Every morning at exactly 6:15, she'd wake up in the same bedroom she'd shared with David for 38 years, make her coffee in the same blue ceramic mug they'd bought on their honeymoon in Vancouver, and spend exactly 20 minutes reading the Seattle Times while watching the sunrise paint Mount Rainier pink through her kitchen window. Her days followed a rhythm that brought her deep satisfaction. 3 days a week, she'd drive her faithful Honda to the small office she maintained in Bellevue, where she still took on select consulting projects for longtime clients who trusted her expertise in enterprise software implementation. At 73, Margaret could troubleshoot database issues that left programmers half her age scratching their heads. Her mind remained razor-sharp, a fact that would prove crucial in the battles ahead. The other 4 days were hers completely. She volunteered at the Wallingford Food Bank every Tuesday, sorting donations with a precision that made the coordinator joke that Margaret could organize a hurricane. Thursdays were for her book club, where 8 women who'd been friends for over 20 years dissected everything from literary fiction to true crime with the intensity of Supreme Court justices. Fridays belonged to her garden, where she grew the most spectacular tomatoes in the neighborhood and maintained flower beds that made passers-by stop and stare. But Margaret's greatest joy was her relationship with Michael. Every Sunday without fail, they'd meet for dim sum at Jade Garden in the International District, the same restaurant where she'd taken him as a child to connect with his Chinese heritage. They'd spend 2 hours catching up on his work as a software engineer at Amazon, her latest consulting projects, and their shared love of hiking the Cascade Mountains. Michael would always order too much food, just like his father used to do, and Margaret would laugh and pack the leftovers for him to take home. These Sunday lunches represented everything beautiful about their relationship. Michael respected her intelligence, sought her business advice, and never once made her feel like a burden as she aged. He'd inherited his father's gentle nature and his mother's analytical mind, creating a man who was both successful and kind. Margaret often told friends that raising Michael was her greatest accomplishment, more important than any business deal or financial milestone. Her financial situation was extraordinarily comfortable, though you'd never know it from her lifestyle. Chen Tech Solutions had been acquired by a multinational firm in 2018 for $32 million, adding to the careful investments she'd made over 5 decades. Her total net worth had grown to $47 million by 2023, a number that still amazed her when she reviewed her quarterly statements. She'd grown up in a family where her parents saved every penny, where waste was considered sinful, and where security meant having enough put away to weather any storm. Margaret's relationship with money was complicated by her immigrant background and the memory of her parents' struggles. Her father had worked in a cannery, her mother had cleaned houses, and they'd both sacrificed everything so Margaret could go to college and study computer science when it was still unusual for women to enter the field. Every dollar she'd earned felt like honoring their sacrifice, which is why she lived so modestly despite her wealth. She drove old cars, bought generic groceries, and wore clothes until they literally fell apart. But Margaret wasn't cheap when it mattered. She'd paid for Michael's entire college education at the University of Washington, including his master's degree, without him taking a single loan. She donated quietly but generously to causes she believed in, particularly organizations that helped immigrant families and supported women in technology. Her accountant estimated she gave away roughly $200,000 annually to various charities, though she never publicized these donations. The one luxury Margaret allowed herself was travel. Every year, she'd take one significant trip, often to visit her extended family in Taiwan or to explore places she and David had dreamed of seeing together. She'd upgraded to business class in her 60s, justifying it as necessary for her back problems, though she secretly loved the extra comfort. These trips filled photo albums that covered her living room coffee table, each picture representing a memory she treasured. Her social life was rich but small. Besides her book club friends, she had a close relationship with her next-door neighbors, the Johnsons, who'd lived there almost as long as she had. Mrs. Johnson was 81 and still sharp as a tack, and the two women would sit on Margaret's front porch summer evenings, drinking iced tea and solving the world's problems. Margaret also maintained friendships with former colleagues and clients, people who'd watched her build her company and respected both her technical skills and her integrity. Margaret's home reflected her personality perfectly. The craftsman-style house was immaculately maintained, but not fancy, filled with furniture she and David had collected over decades rather than anything designer or trendy. Family photos covered every surface, chronicling Michael's growth from a chubby toddler to a successful adult. Her kitchen was the heart of the home, where she still cooked elaborate meals even though she was feeding only herself most of the time. She'd freeze the leftovers in carefully labeled containers, a habit from when Michael was young and she'd been too busy with work to cook fresh every night. But the most telling detail about Margaret's life was how she spent her quiet evenings. After dinner, she'd settle into David's old recliner with whatever book her club was reading, a cup of jasmine tea steaming on the side table. The chair still smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that brought both comfort and sadness. She'd read until exactly 9:30, then spend 10 minutes reviewing her gratitude journal, a practice she'd started after David's death when grief threatened to overwhelm her. This was Margaret's world in early 2021. Peaceful and productive and filled with small joys. She had her health, her financial security, her beloved son, and a sense that the hard work of building a life was complete. At 71, she was looking forward to a gentle transition into full retirement, more travel, maybe finally learning to paint watercolors like she'd always wanted to try. She had no idea that in 3 months, Michael would call to say he was bringing someone special to Sunday dim sum. She had no idea that this someone would study her home with calculating eyes, ask pointed questions about her business success, and begin a campaign of manipulation so subtle and cruel that it would take Margaret months to recognize what was happening. The inciting incident that would destroy her peaceful world was already in motion, though she wouldn't understand it until much later. Margaret's last Sunday lunch alone with Michael was on February 14th, 2021. Valentine's Day. They laughed about being each other's Valentine, ordered their usual dishes, and talked about the book she was reading and a project he was excited about at work. Margaret paid the check, as always, and hugged him goodbye in the restaurant parking lot. As she watched him drive away in his Tesla, she felt nothing but gratitude for the relationship they'd built and the life she'd created. If she'd known what was coming, she might have held on to that moment longer. The first crack in Margaret's perfect world appeared on a surprisingly warm Sunday in March 2021, when Michael arrived at Jade Garden with someone who would change everything. Jessica Hamilton was stunning in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and expensive maintenance. At 27, she had honey blonde hair that caught the light perfectly, porcelain skin that suggested premium skincare routines, and a smile that could power downtown Seattle. She wore designer jeans that probably cost more than Margaret's entire monthly clothing budget and carried a Hermes bag that Margaret recognized from a magazine article about luxury goods. But what struck Margaret most was how Jessica commanded attention without seeming to try. Other diners glanced at their table, restaurant staff hovered longer than necessary, and even Michael seemed slightly dazzled by his own good fortune. Jessica greeted Margaret with a warm hug and the kind of enthusiasm that felt almost too bright, like stage lighting designed to blind the audience to what was happening in the shadows. "Mrs. Chen, I've heard so much about you," Jessica said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that made everything sound charming. "Michael talks about you constantly. He says you're the smartest businesswoman he's ever known." The compliment felt genuine, delivered with eye contact that suggested real interest, and Margaret found herself immediately disarmed. As they settled into their booth, Jessica asked all the right questions. She wanted to know about Margaret's journey as a woman in technology, expressed genuine amazement at building a company from nothing, and listened with rapt attention to stories about the early days of Chen Tech Solutions. She seemed particularly fascinated by the financial aspects, asking thoughtful questions about investment strategies and business valuations that impressed Margaret with their sophistication. "I work in marketing for a pharmaceutical company," Jessica explained when Margaret asked about her background. "Nothing as exciting as building a tech empire, but I've always been interested in entrepreneurship. My grandmother left me a small inheritance when I graduated college, and I've been trying to grow it through smart investments. I'd love to pick your brain sometime about portfolio management." Margaret felt a warm glow of pride and connection. Here was a young woman who appreciated her accomplishments, who saw her as more than just Michael's elderly mother. They spent 2 hours at lunch, far longer than usual, with Jessica asking detailed questions about everything from Margaret's college experience to her travel plans. She seemed genuinely interested in every answer, taking mental notes and following up with insightful observations. But what really won Margaret over was how Jessica treated Michael. She clearly adored him, touching his arm when she laughed at his jokes, including him in every conversation, and looking at him with the kind of love that reminded Margaret of her early days with David. After lunch, as they walked to their cars, Jessica hugged Margaret again and said, "I hope we can be close. I've always wanted a mother figure like you." The words hit Margaret directly in her heart. She'd missed having another woman in her life since her own mother's death 15 years earlier. The possibility of gaining a daughter at this stage of her life felt like an unexpected gift, a chance to share the wisdom and love she'd accumulated over 7 decades. Over the next few months, Jessica became a regular presence in Margaret's life, and at first, everything felt wonderful. She'd call Margaret twice a week just to chat, asking for advice about everything from career decisions to recipe suggestions. She remembered details from their conversations, sent thoughtful thank you notes after every dinner, and always offered to help with dishes or gardening when she visited. Jessica also brought energy and youth into Margaret's quiet world. She introduced Margaret to new restaurants, convinced her to try a yoga class, and even helped her set up Instagram so she could share photos of her garden. Margaret found herself looking forward to these interactions, feeling more connected to contemporary culture through Jessica's eyes. But the first subtle red flag appeared in June 2021. During a dinner party, Margaret threw to introduce Jessica to her book club friends. Margaret had spent days preparing, making all of Jessica's favorite dishes, and even buying fresh flowers for every room. She was proud to show off her beautiful, intelligent future daughter-in-law to women who'd watched her navigate decades of challenges alone. Jessica was charming throughout the evening. But Margaret noticed something odd during a conversation about retirement planning. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned her struggle to maintain her standard of living on a fixed income, Jessica glanced meaningfully at Margaret and said, "Oh, Margaret doesn't have to worry about those kinds of problems. She's set for life with all her tech money." The comment felt somehow off, too knowing and too public, but Margaret dismissed it as Jessica simply being proud of her success. Later, when they were cleaning up, Jessica made another observation that stuck in Margaret's mind. "Your house is so charming, but it must be worth a fortune now with Seattle real estate prices. Have you thought about downsizing and investing the difference?" Margaret explained that she loved her home and had no interest in moving, but Jessica pressed the point. "I just think about your future care needs. Wouldn't it be smarter to liquidate some assets while you're healthy and can make good decisions?" The suggestion was reasonable, even caring, but something about the way Jessica's eyes lit up when discussing Margaret's assets felt uncomfortable. The pattern continued throughout the summer. Jessica would ask increasingly detailed questions about Margaret's financial situation, always framed as concern or admiration. She wanted to know about Margaret's investment strategies, her estate planning, her insurance policies. She'd bring up stories about elderly relatives who'd been taken advantage of by financial advisors, suggesting that Margaret might want to involve family members more closely in her money management. "Michael's so busy with work," Jessica would say. "I worry that you're handling all this alone. What if something happened to you? Wouldn't it make sense to have someone you trust involved in your financial decisions?" Margaret began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with these conversations, though she couldn't articulate why. Jessica's concerns seemed genuine, her suggestions were practical, and her interest in Margaret's well-being appeared authentic. But the sheer frequency of money-related discussions started to wear on Margaret's nerves. The first real crisis hit in September 2021, when Jessica suggested that Margaret might want to consider making Michael her power of attorney, just in case. The conversation happened during what should have been a pleasant afternoon in Margaret's garden, with Jessica helping plant bulbs for spring flowers. "I was reading this article about elderly people being targeted by scammers," Jessica said, not looking up from the tulip bulbs she was arranging. "It made me think about how vulnerable you might be, living alone with so much wealth. What if someone convinced you to make bad financial decisions? At least if Michael had power of attorney, there would be a safeguard." Margaret's hands stopped moving in the soil. "I'm 71, Jessica, not 91. My mind is perfectly sharp, and I've been managing money successfully for 50 years. "Of course," Jessica said quickly, her tone soothing. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just worry about you, and I know Michael does too. He's mentioned being concerned about your isolation, especially as you get older." The suggestion that Michael was worried about her competence felt like a slap. Margaret had just successfully completed a complex consulting project that had earned her client $2 million in efficiency savings. Her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Her decisions were careful and well-researched, and the idea that she needed oversight felt insulting and patronizing. But what really disturbed Margaret was the realization that Jessica and Michael had been discussing her behind her back. The thought of her son and daughter-in-law analyzing her mental capacity and financial vulnerability felt like a betrayal of the trust she'd worked decades to build with Michael. That night, Margaret called Michael directly. "Jessica mentioned that you're concerned about my ability to manage my finances. Is there something specific that's worrying you?" Michael sounded surprised and slightly defensive. "Mom, I'm not worried about your competence. Jessica just mentioned that it might be good to have some redundancy in your planning, that's all. She's been researching elder care issues for her grandmother, and some of the statistics are pretty scary about financial exploitation. Michael, I want to be very clear about this. I am not elderly in the sense that requires oversight. My mind is completely sharp, my financial decisions are sound, and I don't need or want someone else managing my affairs. I know, Mom. I'm sorry if Jessica gave you the wrong impression. She's just looking out for you. But the conversation left Margaret feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't shake. She began to notice things about Jessica that she'd previously overlooked or excused. The way Jessica's eyes would sweep Margaret's house during visits, cataloging furniture and artwork with an appraiser's attention to detail. How Jessica always steered conversations toward Margaret's business success and financial achievements. The frequency with which Jessica mentioned elderly relatives who'd left substantial inheritances to younger family members. Most disturbing was the gradual change in Jessica's attitude toward Margaret's lifestyle choices. What had once been respectful admiration for Margaret's frugality became subtle criticism disguised as concern. Jessica would comment on Margaret's old car, suggesting it might not be safe for someone her age. She'd notice Margaret's worn furniture and mention seeing beautiful pieces at estate sales that would be perfect for your house. She'd talk about luxury senior living communities with amazing amenities that would be so much easier than maintaining this big house. Each comment was reasonable on its surface, delivered with apparent love and concern. But the cumulative effect was to make Margaret feel like her choices were somehow inadequate or naive. Jessica had a gift for making suggestions that sounded caring, but carried an underlying message that Margaret's way of living was wrong. The breaking point came in November 2021, during Thanksgiving dinner at Margaret's house. She'd spent 2 days preparing a feast for 12 people, including Michael, Jessica, the Johnsons from next door, and several book club friends. Everything was perfect, from the golden turkey to the homemade cranberry sauce that had been Margaret's mother's recipe. During dessert, Jessica made what sounded like a casual observation, but felt like a calculated attack. Margaret, you really outdid yourself with this meal. Though I have to say, it makes me worry about how much work you're taking on. Maybe next year we should consider having Thanksgiving catered? I know several excellent services that could take the stress off you. Mrs. Johnson immediately protested. Margaret makes the best Thanksgiving dinner in Seattle. Why would she want it catered? Jessica's smile remained warm, but her eyes hardened slightly. I just think about the future. Margaret won't want to be doing this level of entertaining forever. It might be good to start transitioning to easier options. Margaret felt every eye at the table turn to her, waiting for her response. The implication was clear. She was too old for the level of hosting she'd been doing successfully for decades. Jessica had essentially announced to Margaret's closest friends that she was declining, needed help, and required management of her social activities. I enjoy cooking for people I love, Margaret said quietly. It's not work for me, it's pleasure. Of course, Jessica said, reaching over to pat Margaret's hand in a gesture that felt condescending. I just want to make sure you're not overextending yourself. The conversation moved on, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been publicly diminished in her own home. Jessica had positioned herself as the concerned caretaker and Margaret as the aging woman who needed oversight. Worse, she'd done it in front of the people whose respect and friendship Margaret valued most. That night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret sat in David's recliner and tried to process what was happening. She was beginning to understand that Jessica's interest in her wasn't about building a loving relationship. It was about positioning herself as Margaret's caretaker and heir, gradually undermining Margaret's independence and authority while appearing devoted and concerned. But Margaret's biggest realization was the most painful one. Michael seemed completely oblivious to what was happening. He saw Jessica's behavior as loving attention to his mother's needs. He didn't recognize the subtle power plays, the calculated undermining, or the gradually escalating campaign to position Margaret as incompetent and Jessica as her natural successor. Margaret was facing a crisis she'd never anticipated. How do you protect yourself from someone who's attacking you with apparent love? How do you maintain your independence when the threat comes disguised as care? And most heartbreakingly, how do you protect your relationship with your son when his wife is systematically poisoning him against your competence? The woman who'd built a $47 million company through intelligence, determination, and careful planning was about to discover that all her business acumen meant nothing when facing an enemy who attacked through affection and concern. Jessica Hamilton was playing a game Margaret had never learned the rules for, and the stakes were everything Margaret had worked her entire life to build. The darkness descended gradually, like a Seattle winter that starts with shorter days and ends in a gray depression that makes you forget the sun ever existed. By spring 2022, Margaret's life had become unrecognizable, though the changes had been so subtle that she couldn't pinpoint exactly when everything went wrong. The transformation in Michael was the most devastating part. The son who had once called her for advice on everything from career decisions to what wine to bring to dinner parties now barely consulted her on major life choices. When he and Jessica announced their engagement in March 2022, Margaret learned about it through a text message with a photo of Jessica's ring. No phone call, no special dinner, no opportunity for Margaret to share in their joy or offer her blessing. "We wanted to tell you in person," Michael explained when Margaret called, hurt and confused. But Jessica thought a photo would be more fun, more modern. "She's really good at that social media stuff." Margaret tried to hide her disappointment, but the message was clear. Jessica's preferences now took priority over Margaret's feelings. The woman who had raised Michael, supported his dreams, and been his closest confidant for 38 years was being pushed to the sidelines of his life. The wedding planning became a particular source of pain. Jessica included Margaret in group texts about flowers and venues, but every suggestion Margaret made was politely dismissed. When Margaret offered to pay for the reception at the Four Seasons, where she and David had celebrated their 25th anniversary, Jessica explained that they'd already booked a more intimate venue that better matched their vision. "We really appreciate the offer," Jessica said during one of their increasingly rare phone calls. "But Michael and I want this to feel like our celebration, not something his family is controlling with their money." "I'm sure you understand." Margaret did understand, perhaps more than Jessica realized. She was being told that her financial contribution came with unacceptable strings attached, that her involvement would somehow taint their special day. The message was clear. Your money isn't welcome unless it comes without expectations or influence. But the cruelest cut came when Margaret discovered that Jessica's family was heavily involved in every aspect of the wedding planning. Jessica's mother was helping choose the dress, her sister was the maid of honor, and her cousins were handling decorations and music. Margaret's role had been reduced to writing a check and showing up on the designated day. The isolation extended beyond wedding planning into every aspect of Margaret's relationship with Michael. Their Sunday dim sum tradition ended in April 2022, replaced by occasional group dinners where Jessica dominated the conversation and Michael seemed to have forgotten how to talk to his mother one-on-one. When Margaret suggested they resume their private lunches, Michael explained that Jessica felt left out when he and Margaret spent time together without her. "She wants to be close to you too. Mom, can't we all just hang out together?" Margaret tried to explain that she valued her individual relationship with her son, that some conversations were easier without an audience, but Michael seemed genuinely confused by her needs. Jessica had somehow convinced him that Margaret's desire for private time was exclusionary rather than natural. The financial pressure began in earnest during the summer of 2022. Jessica's suggestions about Margaret's lifestyle and spending became increasingly frequent and pointed. She'd mention articles about seniors who'd been scammed, stories about older adults making poor investment decisions, and statistics about age-related cognitive decline that supposedly started earlier than most people realized. "I read that people start losing financial judgment capacity in their early 70s, even when they seem completely sharp otherwise," Jessica said during one particularly memorable conversation. "The decline is so gradual that the person doesn't notice it themselves. That's why so many smart people end up making terrible money decisions later in life." Margaret was 72 and had just successfully negotiated a consulting contract that would earn her $300,000 over 6 months. Her declining mind was still sharp enough to outthink software engineers a third of her age and structure deals that impressed seasoned business executives. But Jessica's constant implications that she was becoming incompetent began to chip away at her confidence. The most insidious part was how Jessica would frame her concerns as love. "I worry about you living alone with so much responsibility," she'd say. "What if someone takes advantage of your generous nature? What if you get confused about a contract or investment?" Michael would never forgive himself if something happened to your financial security. The pressure to involve Michael in her financial decisions became relentless. Jessica would bring up power of attorney, just as a safety measure, suggest that Michael should review Margaret's investment statements to make sure everything looks right, and hint that Margaret's accountant might not have her best interests at heart since he wasn't family. Margaret's resistance to these suggestions was painted as stubbornness or, worse, as evidence of the cognitive decline Jessica claimed to be worried about. Why wouldn't you want Michael involved in protecting your assets? Unless you're not thinking clearly about the risks you're facing. The social isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Margaret's new reality. Jessica had a remarkable talent for making Margaret feel unwelcome in her own relationships. During book club meetings at Margaret's house, Jessica would monopolize conversations, interrupt Margaret's contributions, and make observations that subtly undermined Margaret's credibility. "Margaret's been so forgetful lately," Jessica mentioned during one gathering, after Margaret had briefly struggled to remember a character's name in the book they were discussing. "I worry that she's taking on too much with her consulting work. Maybe it's time to think about full retirement." The comment was delivered with apparent concern, but it planted seeds of doubt in her friends' minds. Margaret began to notice that her book club friends were treating her differently, speaking to her more slowly, offering help with simple tasks she'd always managed independently, and exchanging glances when she made perfectly normal comments. Margaret's attempts to address Jessica's behavior directly were met with hurt confusion and tearful denials. When Margaret finally confronted her about the constant financial pressure, Jessica's response was masterful manipulation disguised as wounded love. "I can't believe you think I have ulterior motives," Jessica said, tears welling in her eyes. "I love you like my own mother. Every suggestion I make comes from wanting to protect you and make sure you're safe. If caring about your well-being makes you uncomfortable, maybe I should step back from our relationship." The threat of withdrawal was implicit but clear. Accept Jessica's involvement in her financial affairs, or lose access to Michael and any chance of a relationship with future grandchildren. Margaret found herself apologizing for questioning Jessica's motives, promising to be more open to her suggestions, and feeling guilty for having doubts about someone who claimed to love her. Michael's response to Margaret's concerns was the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation. When Margaret tried to explain that Jessica's behavior felt controlling and manipulative, Michael dismissed her worries as generational differences and personality conflicts. "Mom, Jessica grew up in a family where everyone was involved in each other's business. That's how she shows love. She's not trying to control you. She's trying to take care of you." When Margaret mentioned feeling isolated and excluded from their relationship, Michael suggested she was being too sensitive and needed to make more effort to understand Jessica's perspective. "She's doing her best to fit into our family. Maybe you could try being more welcoming instead of looking for problems." The worst part was Margaret's growing realization that Michael was beginning to see her through Jessica's eyes. Instead of the strong, independent woman who'd raised him and built a successful business, he was starting to perceive her as a lonely, aging widow who needed management and protection. Jessica's campaign of undermining Margaret's competence was working exactly as intended. By October 2022, Margaret found herself second-guessing decisions she'd made confidently for decades. When her financial advisor suggested a portfolio adjustment, she wondered if Jessica was right about advisors taking advantage of elderly clients. When she forgot where she'd placed her reading glasses, she worried that it might be the cognitive decline Jessica kept mentioning. When she struggled to operate a new smartphone app, she questioned whether she was becoming too old to manage technology. The self-doubt was poison in her system, undermining 50 years of confidence and competence. Margaret began to avoid making financial decisions, postponing investments, and delaying important choices because she wasn't sure she could trust her own judgment. The woman who'd once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with complete confidence now felt paralyzed by simple choices about her own money. Her physical health began to suffer under the stress. Margaret developed insomnia, lying awake at night analyzing every conversation with Jessica, looking for hidden meanings and ulterior motives. She lost 15 pounds because anxiety killed her appetite, and her doctor prescribed blood pressure medication for the first time in her life. The stress was literally making her sick, which only reinforced Jessica's narrative about her declining health and need for support. The lowest point came on December 15, 2022, during what should have been a celebration of Michael and Jessica's engagement party. Margaret had offered to host the event at her house, but Jessica had insisted on a restaurant venue to make it easier on everyone. Margaret arrived at the upscale Bellevue restaurant to find herself seated at a table with people she barely knew, while Jessica's family occupied the places of honor near the happy couple. During the toasts, Jessica's father spoke eloquently about gaining a son. Jessica's sister shared funny stories about their childhood, and Michael's boss offered career congratulations. When it came time for Margaret to speak, Jessica quickly stood up and said, "Let's save the family speeches for the wedding. Tonight is about celebrating with friends." Margaret sat down without speaking, her prepared words about watching Michael grow into the man she was proud to call her son stillborn in her throat. She watched her son laugh and celebrate with people who'd known him for 2 years while she, the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his happiness, sat silent and ignored. The symbolism was devastating and complete. Margaret had been erased from her own son's life while someone else's family had taken her place. She was becoming a stranger at celebrations of milestones she'd helped make possible, an afterthought in the life she'd spent decades nurturing. Driving home alone that night, Margaret realized she was losing the only thing that had ever mattered more than her business success, her relationship with Michael. Jessica's campaign was working perfectly, isolating Margaret from her son while positioning herself as his primary family influence. Worse, Margaret could see the endgame clearly now. Once Jessica married Michael and potentially had children, Margaret would become completely expendable. A troublesome elderly relative who required management until she could be convinced to sign over her assets and fade into the background. Margaret pulled into her driveway and sat in her car for 20 minutes, crying harder than she had since David's funeral. She was facing the possibility of spending her remaining years alone, estranged from the son she adored, watching him build a life that had no meaningful place for her. All her wealth, all her success, all her careful planning for the future meant nothing if she ended up dying isolated and forgotten. But in that moment of complete despair, something shifted in Margaret's mind. The tears stopped, and a cold clarity replaced the emotional chaos she'd been living in for months. She was not a helpless victim, despite Jessica's attempts to convince everyone. The transformation began at 3:17 in the morning on December 16, 2022, when Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing down everything Jessica had said and done over the past 18 months. What started as an emotional purge became something far more powerful, a detailed analysis of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that was so sophisticated it deserved professional recognition. Margaret approached the task like the business strategist she'd always been, creating columns for dates, incidents, witnesses present, and probable objectives. The pattern that emerged was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Jessica hadn't made a single spontaneous comment about Margaret's age, finances, or competence. Every suggestion had been carefully timed. Every criticism had been strategically placed, and every manipulation had been designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. The financial pressure had escalated in precise increments, starting with general concern about elder fraud and progressing to specific suggestions about power of attorney and asset management. The social isolation had followed a similar pattern, beginning with minor interruptions and evolving into complete domination of group conversations. Even Jessica's apparent affection had been weaponized, creating a dependency that made Margaret feel guilty for questioning her motives. But the most revealing pattern was Jessica's escalating confidence. In the beginning, Her manipulations had been subtle and tentative, testing Margaret's boundaries and responses. As Margaret failed to push back effectively, Jessica's attacks had become bolder and more direct. She was no longer worried about hiding her intentions because she believed Margaret was too weak, too isolated, and too dependent on maintaining the relationship to fight back. Margaret realized she was dealing with a predator who'd perfected her techniques through practice. Jessica's knowledge of elder manipulation tactics was too sophisticated to be amateur research for a grandmother. The psychological pressure points she targeted were too specific, her timing too precise, and her responses to resistance too polished. This wasn't Jessica's first campaign against an elderly target. The insight that changed everything came when Margaret Googled Jessica's background beyond the basic information she'd been given. What she found made her blood run cold. Jessica Hamilton had been married before, to a 68-year-old widower named Robert Morrison in Phoenix. The marriage had lasted 2 years before Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving Jessica as his sole beneficiary. The obituary mentioned his substantial real estate holdings and successful accounting practice. Further research revealed that Jessica had also been engaged to a 71-year-old retired surgeon in Dallas. Though that relationship had ended when the man's children hired a private investigator who discovered Jessica was simultaneously dating 2 other wealthy older men. The pattern was unmistakable. Jessica specialized in targeting successful older adults through their adult children, using romance and fake family bonds to gain access to substantial inheritances. But Michael wasn't elderly, which meant Jessica's strategy with Margaret was different, but equally calculated. She was using her marriage to Michael as a way to position herself as Margaret's natural heir while systematically isolating Margaret from other potential beneficiaries. Once Jessica had children with Michael, she'd become the mother of Margaret's only grandchildren, giving her ultimate leverage over Margaret's emotional and financial decisions. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fury. She wasn't losing her mind, becoming paranoid, or misreading normal family dynamics. She was the target of a sophisticated con artist who'd perfected her techniques on previous victims. Jessica's apparent love was completely fabricated. Her concern was strategic manipulation, and her suggestions about Margaret's declining competence were projection tactics designed to justify taking control of Margaret's assets. The relief of understanding was immediately followed by volcanic rage. Jessica had stolen 18 months of Margaret's life, poisoned her relationship with her son, damaged her health, and systematically destroyed her confidence and peace of mind. Worse, she'd done it all while pretending to love Margaret, accepting her gifts and hospitality, and positioning herself as a caring daughter figure. But Margaret's anger quickly crystallized into something far more dangerous, a strategic plan for complete destruction. Jessica had made a crucial error in targeting someone with Margaret's background. A lifetime of building and protecting a business empire had taught Margaret how to identify threats, gather evidence, and execute devastating responses to competitors who tried to destroy her. Jessica might be skilled at emotional manipulation, but Margaret was skilled at warfare. The first step was evidence collection, and Margaret approached it with the systematic thoroughness that had made her consulting company legendary for detailed analysis. She purchased a high-quality digital recording device that looked like a simple pen, researched the legal requirements for recording conversations in Washington state, and began documenting every interaction with Jessica with the precision of a federal prosecutor building a case. Washington's 2-party consent law meant Margaret couldn't legally record Jessica without permission, but she could take detailed notes immediately after every conversation, document Jessica's behavior in front of witnesses, and create a comprehensive record of the manipulation campaign. Margaret also started reaching out to Robert Morrison's children in Phoenix, tracking down the Dallas surgeon's family, and building a case file that would destroy Jessica's credibility forever. The recording breakthrough came in February 2023, when Jessica made a critical mistake during a phone conversation. She called Margaret to discuss wedding plans and, in the middle of the call, mentioned that she was on speakerphone because she was driving. Margaret immediately activated her recording app, realizing that Jessica had just given consent to being recorded by putting Margaret on speaker in her car. "Jessica, I want to make sure I understand your vision for the wedding reception. Could you walk me through your ideas again? What followed was 23 minutes of Jessica outlining plans that revealed her true priorities and character. She discussed the guest list in terms of useful connections and networking opportunities. She mentioned wanting to invite several of her ex-boyfriends to show them what they missed. Most damning. She talked about the wedding as the perfect way to establish our position in Michael's family and social circle. But the most revealing moment came when Jessica discussed the rehearsal dinner. I think we should have your book club friends there, but maybe seat them at a separate table. Some of them are getting pretty old and confused, and I don't want them embarrassing us with inappropriate stories or comments. You know how elderly people can be at social events? Margaret felt her jaw clench as Jessica casually dismissed Margaret's closest friends as embarrassing burdens. These were accomplished women who'd supported Margaret through decades of challenges, including brilliant minds like Mrs. Patterson, a retired federal judge, and Dr. Sarah Kim, a former Microsoft executive. Jessica was reducing them to stereotypes of addled elderly people who couldn't be trusted in polite company. The conversation continued with Jessica making increasingly revealing comments about her expectations for Margaret's behavior and role in their marriage. She expected Margaret to step back from giving Michael career advice, since Jessica was better positioned to understand his industry. She thought Margaret should consider moving to a senior community for her own safety and social opportunities. Most telling, she mentioned that she and Michael had discussed the inheritance situation and agreed that Margaret's assets should be managed more conservatively to preserve them for future generations. By the end of the call, Margaret had documented Jessica discussing her as if she were already dead, planning Margaret's life without consulting her, and revealing her complete lack of genuine affection or respect. The recording was a masterpiece of self-incrimination, delivered with the confident cruelty of someone who believed her victim was too weak to fight back. Over the next 3 months, Margaret collected 12 more recordings using various pretexts to get Jessica's consent. Each conversation revealed new layers of Jessica's manipulation tactics and true character. She recorded Jessica making cruel jokes about Margaret's age and appearance when she thought only Michael could hear. She captured Jessica discussing strategies for managing Margaret's stubbornness and accelerating her transition to dependence. Most devastating was a recording from April 2023, when Jessica thought she was alone with Michael in Margaret's garden. Margaret had stepped inside to get drinks and activated her phone's recording app, leaving the device on the patio table where it captured Jessica's real opinion of the woman she claimed to love. "Your mother is becoming a real problem," Jessica said, her voice stripped of the warmth she usually projected. "She's so controlling about her money, and she doesn't seem to understand that she's not going to live forever. We need to start preparing for the future, but she acts like she's going to be making her own decisions for another 20 years. Michael's response was barely audible, but Jessica's reply was crystal clear. "I'm not saying we should force anything, but elderly people often need help recognizing when they're no longer capable of managing complex decisions. Your mother's already showing signs of confusion and poor judgment. It would be irresponsible not to step in before she makes mistakes that could hurt everyone." Margaret stood in her kitchen, listening to the woman she'd welcomed into her family discuss her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Jessica's mask had completely slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath the caring daughter-in-law performance. But the most crucial recording came in May 2023, when Margaret deliberately created a scenario designed to expose Jessica's ultimate intentions. She called Jessica and mentioned that she'd been meeting with estate planning attorneys to update her will, a conversation Margaret carefully structured to encourage Jessica to reveal her expectations about inheritance. "I'm so glad you're being proactive about estate planning," Jessica said, her voice bright with interest. "Have you thought about how you want to structure things? I know Michael would want to make sure your wishes are honored, but it's important to consider tax implications and family dynamics." Margaret played her role perfectly, acting like a confused elderly woman seeking guidance from her sophisticated daughter-in-law. "I'm not sure about the tax issues. The lawyer mentioned something about gift exemptions and charitable deductions, but it's all very complicated. "Oh, you definitely want to minimize tax liability," Jessica said, warming to the topic. "Have you considered setting up trusts for Michael and any future grandchildren? That way the money would be protected and managed professionally, but it would still benefit the family." Margaret feigned confusion about the trust concept, encouraging Jessica to elaborate on her vision for Margaret's estate planning. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as helpful advice. Jessica outlined a scenario where Margaret's assets would be placed in trusts managed by Michael and Jessica to ensure professional oversight and family involvement in major decisions. "The beautiful thing about this structure," Jessica explained, "is that you'd still have access to income from the investments, but the principal would be protected from poor decisions or outside influence. And if something happened to your cognitive abilities, Michael and I would already be in position to make sure your care needs were met without any legal complications." Margaret realized she was listening to Jessica outline a plan to gain legal control of her $47 million fortune while keeping Margaret alive and compliant, long enough to avoid inheritance challenges. It was sophisticated financial elder abuse, packaged as loving family planning and delivered with the confidence of someone who believed their victim was too trusting and naive to recognize the trap. The conversation continued for 47 minutes, with Jessica revealing increasingly detailed plans for managing Margaret's wealth, lifestyle, and future care decisions. She discussed senior living facilities that would be perfect for someone with Margaret's needs, investment strategies that would preserve capital while providing steady income, and legal structures that would protect the family's financial security for generations. By the end of the call, Margaret had documented Jessica's complete plan for gaining control of her assets, isolating her from independent decision-making, and positioning herself as Margaret's legal and financial guardian. The recording was devastating evidence of premeditated financial exploitation, delivered in Jessica's own voice with enough detail to support criminal charges. Margaret hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what she'd just heard. Jessica hadn't just been manipulating her emotions and family relationships. She'd been executing a comprehensive plan to steal Margaret's entire life's work while keeping her alive as a compliant source of ongoing income. It was elder abuse elevated to the level of criminal enterprise, and Jessica had documented every detail herself. But Margaret's shock quickly transformed into something Jessica had never anticipated: the cold, calculating fury of a woman who'd spent 50 years destroying competitors who underestimated her intelligence and determination. Jessica had made the fatal error of assuming that emotional manipulation was more powerful than strategic thinking. She was about to discover exactly how wrong she was. The war was far from over, but the battlefield had completely shifted. Margaret was no longer a confused victim struggling to understand what was happening to her. She was a predator who'd identified her target, gathered devastating evidence, and prepared to execute the kind of systematic destruction that had made her legendary in the business world. Jessica Hamilton thought she was closing in on a $47 million payday. Instead, she'd just handed Margaret the weapons needed to destroy her completely, and Margaret intended to use every single one of them with the precision and ruthlessness that had made her one of the most successful businesswomen in Seattle. The hunter was about to be. The counterattack began on June 1, 2023, with a phone call that would change everything. Margaret sat in her kitchen at exactly 9 a.m., surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and a detailed timeline of Jessica's manipulation campaign. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm, and her resolve was absolute. After 6 months of careful planning and evidence gathering, it was time to destroy Jessica Hamilton completely. The first call was to her estate attorney, David Goldstein, who'd handled Margaret's legal affairs for 15 years. "David, I need to schedule an emergency meeting to completely restructure my estate plan. I have evidence of attempted financial exploitation, and I need to ensure my assets are protected before the situation escalates." David had known Margaret long enough to recognize the steel in her voice when she'd made a final decision. "How soon do you need to meet?" "This afternoon." "And David, I need you to prepare paperwork for a complete charitable giving strategy. I want to donate my entire estate to established charities, effective immediately, with provisions for my care during my lifetime, but nothing left for individual inheritance. The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly 10 seconds. Margaret, that's a $47 million decision. Are you certain you want to move that quickly? I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I have recordings and documentation that will explain everything. Can you clear your afternoon? By 4 p.m. that same day, Margaret had signed documents that transferred her entire fortune to a charitable remainder trust, with herself as the sole beneficiary during her lifetime, and 5 carefully chosen charities as the ultimate recipients: the Seattle Children's Hospital, the local food bank where she'd volunteered, the Asian Women's Scholarship Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and the Alzheimer's Research Foundation would inherit everything she'd worked her entire life to build. The legal structure was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Margaret retained full control of her assets during her lifetime, continued to receive all investment income, and could revoke the arrangement if circumstances changed. But upon her death, every penny would go to charity, leaving Jessica Hamilton with absolutely nothing except the public humiliation of being exposed as a failed con artist. But Margaret's real masterstroke was the timing of her revelation. She decided to wait until Jessica's wedding shower, scheduled for July 15th at the Four Seasons, where Jessica would be surrounded by family and friends celebrating her upcoming marriage to Michael. Margaret wanted an audience when she destroyed Jessica's carefully constructed world. The 2 weeks between signing the charitable trust documents and the wedding shower were the most peaceful Margaret had experienced in 2 years. The constant anxiety about protecting her assets was gone, replaced by the calm satisfaction of knowing that Jessica's entire scheme had already failed completely. Margaret slept through the night for the first time in months. Her appetite returned and her blood pressure normalized, so quickly that her doctor was amazed. Margaret also used those 2 weeks to prepare for the confrontation with the same methodical planning she'd brought to major business negotiations. She had 12 audio recordings. The room was completely silent except for Jessica's recorded voice revealing her true character to 47 people who'd gathered to celebrate her upcoming marriage. With each new recording, Jessica's carefully constructed image crumbled further, exposing the calculating predator underneath the loving daughter-in-law persona. Jessica tried to interrupt twice, standing up and attempting to explain that the recordings were taken out of context. But Margaret calmly continued her presentation. I want everyone to understand that these aren't isolated comments or misunderstandings. This is a pattern of behavior that Jessica has used before, with other elderly targets in other cities. Margaret then revealed Jessica's previous marriage to Robert Morrison and her aborted engagement to the Dallas surgeon, providing documentation that showed Jessica's history of targeting wealthy older adults. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of a sophisticated con artist who specialized in inheritance fraud. But Margaret saved her final revelation for last. I want Jessica and everyone else to understand the outcome of her 2-year campaign to gain control of my assets. Yesterday, I completed the legal transfer of my entire $47 million estate to charitable organizations. Upon my death, every penny will go to charities I've supported for decades. Jessica Hamilton will inherit absolutely nothing from me except the public knowledge of her failed attempt at elder financial abuse. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Jessica sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and panic as she processed the magnitude of her failure. Margaret had not only exposed her tactics, but had destroyed her ultimate objective while documenting everything for legal and social posterity. Jessica's mother was the first to speak, her voice shaking with humiliation. Jessica, is this true? Have you been lying to us about your relationship with Margaret? Jessica's attempted response was a masterpiece of desperate manipulation, but the recordings had already destroyed her credibility completely. She tried to claim that Margaret was suffering from age-related paranoia, that the recordings were somehow fake, and that her comments had been misunderstood or taken out of context. But the evidence was too comprehensive and too damning for any explanation except the truth. Michael, who had been notably absent from Jessica's recorded conversations about manipulating his mother, sat in stunned silence as he processed the revelation that his fiancée had been systematically abusing the woman who'd raised him. Margaret watched her son's face transform from confusion to understanding, to absolute fury as he realized the extent of Jessica's deception. The party ended in chaos, with guests leaving in uncomfortable silence while Jessica's family demanded answers and Michael confronted his fiancée about her betrayal of his mother's trust. Margaret collected her speaker and purse, hugged the few friends who stayed to support her, and left Jessica to face the consequences of her actions alone. But Margaret's public exposure of Jessica was only the beginning of the consequences. Within hours of the wedding shower, word of Jessica's manipulation tactics and failed inheritance scheme had spread throughout Seattle's professional and social communities. Michael's colleagues shared the story. Jessica's behavior became gossip at country clubs and charity events, and her reputation was destroyed completely and permanently. Michael called Margaret that evening, his voice raw with emotion and shame. "Mom, I am so sorry. I had no idea what she was doing to you. I should have seen it, should have protected you, should have listened when you tried to tell me something was wrong." Margaret's response was gentle but firm. "Michael, Jessica is a professional. She's very good at what she does, and part of her skill is making her targets feel isolated and their concerns seem unreasonable. You're not responsible for her choices or her character. But I am responsible for not protecting you from someone who was hurting you in my name. Mom, I will never forgive myself for letting this happen." Margaret felt her heart break for her son, who was processing the reality that his fiancée had been using their relationship to abuse his mother. "Michael, the important thing is that it's over now. Jessica can never hurt either of us again, and we can rebuild our relationship without her interference." The wedding was canceled within 48 hours. Jessica's family returned to the East Coast in shame and anger, cutting all contact with their daughter when they realized she'd embarrassed them in front of Seattle's social elite. Michael moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Jessica and began the painful process of extracting himself from their shared financial obligations. Most satisfying for Margaret was the legal aftermath. Armed with Margaret's recordings and evidence of Jessica's previous targeting of elderly victims, prosecutors in both Washington and Arizona opened investigations into her activities. The Dallas surgeon's family provided additional evidence of Jessica's attempted fraud, and a pattern of interstate elder abuse began to emerge that would likely result in serious criminal charges. But the most profound change was in Margaret's own life. The constant stress and anxiety that had dominated her existence for 2 years was completely gone, replaced by a deep sense of peace and satisfaction. She'd not only protected herself but had ensured that Jessica could never target another elderly victim with the same tactics. Margaret's relationship with Michael recovered quickly once Jessica's poisonous influence was removed. They resumed their Sunday dim sum tradition, and Michael began asking for his mother's advice again, recognizing that her wisdom and experience were valuable resources rather than obstacles to his independence. The charitable trust structure Margaret had established brought unexpected joy to her daily life. She became actively involved with each of the 5 organizations that would inherit her estate, serving on boards, attending events, and using her business expertise to help them operate more effectively. Instead of worrying about preserving wealth for an ungrateful heir, Margaret was investing in causes that aligned with her values and would continue her legacy long after her death. Margaret also discovered that giving away her inheritance was remarkably liberating. The constant worry about protecting her assets from manipulation was gone, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing her life's work would benefit children, families, and communities rather than enriching someone who tried to abuse her trust. 6 months after the wedding shower revelation, Margaret received a letter from Robert Morrison's children in Phoenix, thanking her for exposing Jessica's tactics and providing evidence that helped them recover some of the assets Jessica had stolen from their father's estate. The letter mentioned that Jessica was facing felony charges in Arizona and that Margaret's courage in speaking publicly had encouraged other victims to come forward. Margaret realized that her decision to fight back had protected not only herself, but future victims who might have fallen prey to Jessica's manipulation tactics. The woman who'd tried to steal Margaret's fortune had instead become the subject of a criminal investigation that would likely end with prison time and permanent damage to her ability to target other elderly victims. The transformation was complete. Margaret had gone from victim to victor, from isolated target to protected philanthropist, from confused elderly woman to celebrated example of how to resist elder abuse. She'd not only saved her fortune, but had turned Jessica's attack into an opportunity to create a lasting legacy of charitable giving and community support. But the most important victory was personal. Margaret had reclaimed her relationship with her son, her confidence in her own judgment, and her peace of mind. The woman who'd been systematically undermined and manipulated had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live life on her own terms. Jessica Hamilton had wanted to destroy Margaret Chen and steal her life's work. Instead, she'd motivated Margaret to create a legacy that would outlast them both, while destroying her own future in the process. It was poetic justice on a scale that even Margaret couldn't have imagined when she first began to suspect something was wrong. 2 years later, as Margaret sat in her garden on a perfect Seattle spring morning, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from victim to victor and changed her understanding of strength, family, and legacy. The woman who had once feared losing everything had discovered that true security came not from protecting assets but from knowing her values and standing up for them regardless of the cost. Jessica Hamilton was serving a 3-year sentence in federal prison for elder fraud and interstate financial crimes. Her conviction based largely on the recordings Margaret had gathered and the testimony of other victims who came forward after Margaret's public exposure of Jessica's tactics. The woman who had specialized in targeting wealthy elderly individuals had become a cautionary tale in law, enforcement circles, and a subject of study in social work. Programs focused on elder abuse prevention. Michael had married again in 2024 to a kindergarten teacher named Sarah, who treated Margaret with genuine warmth and respect. Their relationship was everything Margaret had hoped for with Jessica, built on authentic affection rather than calculated manipulation. When Sarah became pregnant with Margaret's first grandchild, she insisted that Margaret be heavily involved in planning and preparation, understanding that family bonds were strengthened through inclusion rather than control. But the most profound change was in Margaret herself. The experience of recognizing manipulation, gathering evidence, and fighting back had revealed reserves of strength and resilience she'd forgotten she possessed. The woman who'd once worried about appearing too old or too trusting had become a powerful advocate for elder rights and financial protection, speaking at conferences and helping other families recognize the warning signs of inheritance. Fraud. Margaret's charitable giving had evolved into active philanthropy that brought daily satisfaction and purpose to her life. Instead of worrying about preserving wealth for ungrateful heirs, she was investing in pediatric cancer research, supporting immigrant families, and funding technology education for underserved communities. Her legacy was being built every day through the lives her donations touched and the futures her generosity made possible. The 5 universal lessons from Margaret's story apply to anyone facing manipulation, family conflict, or challenges to their independence and dignity. First, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly what's bothering you. Margaret's initial discomfort with Jessica's behavior was accurate and important, though it took months for her to understand why she felt uneasy. When someone's actions consistently contradict their stated intentions, pay attention to the pattern rather than dismissing individual incidents. Second, document everything when dealing with potential manipulation or abuse. Margaret's systematic approach to recording Jessica's behavior provided the evidence needed to expose her tactics and protect other potential victims. In situations involving family dynamics, financial pressure, or attempts to undermine your competence, detailed documentation becomes your most powerful defense against gaslighting and false narratives. Third, understand that real love and concern never require you to surrender your autonomy or question your competence. Jessica's manipulation was particularly insidious because it was disguised as care and affection, but genuine family relationships strengthen your confidence rather than undermining it. When someone claims to love you while consistently making you feel weak, confused, or dependent, their motives deserve serious scrutiny. Fourth, recognize that your greatest strength in any conflict is often your ability to think strategically and act decisively when the situation requires it. Margaret's business background gave her skills in evidence gathering, strategic planning, and systematic problem-solving that proved more powerful than Jessica's emotional manipulation tactics. Whatever your professional or personal experience, you have capabilities that can be applied to protecting yourself from people who underestimate your intelligence and determination. Finally, remember that the most devastating response to someone trying to steal your legacy is to ensure that legacy serves purposes they can never touch or corrupt. Margaret's decision to donate her entire estate to charity not only defeated Jessica's scheme, but created something beautiful and lasting that reflected Margaret's values rather than her enemy's greed. Sometimes the most powerful victory is making it impossible for your opponent to benefit from their attacks, while using their aggression as motivation to do something meaningful with what they tried to steal. Margaret's story demonstrates that age, kindness, and vulnerability are not weaknesses that predators can exploit indefinitely. They are qualities that, when combined with intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking, can become the foundation for devastating counterattacks against people who mistake gentleness for helplessness. If you're dealing with family manipulation, financial pressure, or attempts to undermine your independence, remember that you have more power than you realize. Document the behavior that concerns you. Trust your instincts about people's motives, and don't hesitate to seek professional help when the situation requires expertise beyond your experience. Most importantly, never let someone else's greed or manipulation divert you from building the legacy you want to leave behind. Margaret Chen's transformation from victim to victor reminds us that our greatest protection against people who want to exploit us is our willingness to fight back with intelligence, evidence, and absolute determination to preserve our dignity and values. Sometimes the most profound victory is not just defeating someone who attacks you, but using their aggression as motivation to create something they could never destroy or diminish. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story of courage, resilience, and ultimate triumph. If this story inspired you or helped you think about challenges in your own life, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you'll be the first to hear more stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when they needed it most. Like this video if Margaret's journey resonated with you, and please share your thoughts in the comments about times when you've had to stand up for yourself or protect something important from people who didn't respect your boundaries. Your stories matter, and they might inspire someone else who's facing their own battle against manipulation and abuse. Remember, you're stronger than you know. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your future.